Today's daf we're going to learn is Pesachim Tzadi Dalid. Today's daf is sponsored by Mona Fishbane in memory of her beloved daughter-in-law Leah Levitz Fishbane Zichrona Levarcha on her 14th yahrzeit. The light of her soul still shines. Leah's spirit lives in those blessed to have loved her. And by Sarah Berelowitz in memory of her mother-in-law Sarah Tiva Bat David Shlomo Aleh Shalom Berelowitz. At the beginning of the Daf Yomi cycle, my husband and I started learning the Daf in order to do a siyum of Masechet Brachot on her yahrzeit. Neither of us thought that we would still be learning the Daf a year later. And in memory of Shachna ben Yehuda Vesara for his Shloshim, and by Betsy Melman in memory of Harold Manshine, Tzvi Menachem Mendel ben Shlomo Vichar Nabela Zichrono Levarcha, on the 37th anniversary of his yahrzeit. My father greeted everyone with a pleasing countenance. His love of family, good-natured disposition, and respect for others continue to inspire me. And by Tina Lam for Fuash Lema of Rivka Chana Bat Sarah Leah. Okay, with that, we'll get started. I will warn you that today's daf is not a simple one. Not simple in terms of we're going to have a Gemara all about the size of the world, the constellations, all sorts of things that are hard for us to understand, or really hard for us to understand how the Gemara understood them. Even if we could understand these things, they obviously had a bit of a different approach to these things. There's a very nice note in the Koren, Steinsalt's Gemara, which talks about how are we supposed to approach these types of sugyot. So if you have access to it, you can read it about the issue that what they talked about doesn't necessarily match our reality. And the Gaonim already, they quote there that the Gaonim already say that you don't have to take these Gemaras seriously in terms of whether they have halachic import or don't have halachic import, but this is not a halachic issue, just like we talk about health issues in the Gemara, the way they understood nutrition, but we don't have to take those as this is the way it is, because they had certain approaches to things. This isn't halacha, this doesn't come from we'll see, some of it does come maybe from Masoret, but there's different ways to understand this. So with that, we'll get started with our daf. Okay, we're going to start from the end of the daf. We ended with, before we get to that whole section, which you'll see why we get there, but first we're going to refresh our memory. We were talking about what is derech rechoka, right? Min hamodi'im v'lachutz, right? And then we said that Rabbi Eliezer has this weird approach, which we'll get to at the very end, that it's from the askufa of the azara is already considered far, even though you're right outside where the shechita is going on, but you're not inside, so that's already far away. Then we brought Ula, who said basically, how far is Modi'in to Yerushalayim? By the way, it's very hard to say this is Modi'in. I checked with my son. He walked once from Modi'in to Jerusalem, so I checked with him last night how long it took him, and he didn't even go to Har Bayit, and he said it took him 9 hours, and he walked really fast. Now, according to this, Modi'in to Yerushalayim is half a day, which is 6 hours. So it's hard to believe that it really is Modi'in, okay? Assuming that they're on foot, which it does seem like they're on foot, although maybe you could say you're riding on a donkey or something. Soon we're going to see, not if you're riding on some sort of fast animal, but maybe it's riding, and then maybe it would be quicker. So now we're going to talk about, we had Ula, who basically explained that it's 15 mil, which is 40 parso, right? I should have just checked the mile, the kilometers, how much it is. I didn't check that, but whether it matches this, right? It certainly doesn't match either, this 15 mil, which we said is 15 kilometers. And then we said, because he holds like Rabbi Barbachanu, holds like Rabbi Yochanan, how much does a person walk in a day? And they walk from, we say, how much does a person walk? So from Alot HaShachar to Netzach Hama, 5 mil. From Shkia to Tzedek Kochavim, 5 mil. You're left with 30, 15 for each half of the day. And that's how we got to 15 mil is half a day. Okay, so now, and we said Modi'in to Yerushalayim is 15 mil, so it's half a day's journey. One thing I want to point out from yesterday that I didn't explain is there's this machloket now between Ula and Rav Yehuda about, is it kol she'eino yachol likanes b'shat shchita, that you can't get there for the time of shchita? There's two different ways to understand this. Some people say we're talking about in the morning, you're more than half a day's journey and you won't make it for the beginning of the shchita, for the beginning of the slaughtering, which starts midday. Some people say, no, we mean at midday, you won't make it to the second half of the day to get there before the end of the shechita. So there's a very big difference in those two, because it'll depend, are you half a journey's away in the morning or you half a journey's away in the afternoon, right? And then there's a big difference between them. Rabbi Yehuda says, if you can't get there b'shat achila, at the time it comes for eating, he doesn't care if you don't get there during the day. As long as you can get there to eat at night, then you're not b'derech rechoka. Okay, now, we ended with this question. The Rabbi asked Ula both on himself and on Rav Yehuda and said, but your approach is crisscross and basically say that it doesn't make sense with your approach about shochatim v'zorkin al tmei sheretz. When it comes to a tmei sheretz, which also can't make it into the temple for the shechita. So you would think that Ula, who says you have to make it there for the shechita, would also say that it's tmei sheretz, you can't be shochatim v'zorkin alav because he can't make it to the temple that day. He can only tovel, right? Go to the mikvah, wait till nighttime, and only then can he come in. And you would have thought that Rabbi Yehuda says, as long as you make it for food, then you're going to be not exempt. Likewise, he would say, at tmei sheretz, since during the day you can slaughter for him, as long as he can eat at night, it's okay. But their approaches are the exact opposite when it comes to shochtim v'zorkin al tmei sheretz. Ula is the one who says you can't do it, and Rabbi Yehuda is the one who says, I'm sorry. Rav Yehuda is the one who says you can't do it, and Ula is the one who says you can do it, and it's the exact opposite of what they say here. So to which the Gemara responds, Amrle, 2 lines from the bottom, from Sadi Gimel Amud Bet, Lo lididi kasha v'lo Rav Yehuda kasha. Okay, it's not difficult for me, and it's not difficult for him. Lididi lo kasha, derech rechoka latahur ve'ein derech rechoka latameh. He says, wait, sheretz and derech rechoka are 2 totally different things. They have different rules entirely. Don't learn one from the other. He says, when it comes to, again, what does Ula say? You have to make it for shat shchita when it comes to derech rechoka. That's derech rechoka. When it comes to tameh, that's something else. Tameh, as long as you'll be tahor the next day for that night, we allow it. Those are 2 totally different things. Just because they're near them, remember, often we say these 2 things are in the verse next to each other. That means they're the same. He says, no. These are 2 totally different things. They have different rules. Derech rechoka is for someone who's tahor. Since you can potentially, right, derech rechoka is something you're tahor. Derech rechoka is not something for a tameh. So basically, we're going to say the rules are different entirely. That's why I can say that when it comes to derech rechoka, it has to be that you can't make it for the shechita. Okay, that's different than for the tameh. L'Rav Yehuda lo kashya tameh sheretz rachmana dachya. He says, oh, also they're different, but he's going to explain better why they're different. He says in the Torah, what does it say? The Torah said you can't do it if you're tamei sheretz. Now, obviously, the Torah didn't say it because if the Torah said it, there wouldn't be a machloket. But he says, I'm going to derive it from something directly stated in the Torah. And then we can say it's just for tuma, but it's not for derech rechoka. Meaning, again, it's the opposite of Ula. The fact that you can make it there at nighttime to eat is enough. Okay, why? Because look at the pasuk in the Torah. It says, Dichtiv ish ish ki hiyeh tameh lanefesh. If you're tameh to someone who died, you're impure. Now, what did we learn already? Milo askina. What was the case of the people who came to Moshe and said we can't do Pesach Rishon? Shechal shvi'i shelo liop erev Pesach. Remember, it was the people who had become tameh to someone to a mate mitzvah. Remember, there was someone who nobody buried. They went and took care of it, even though they knew that their day number 7 was going to come out on erev Pesach, and it was specifically that their day number 7 was on erev Pesach, which means that night they'd already be able to eat. And yet the Torah told them, you can't do it. So there you see, right? That's specifically for tameh. And that's why ain't shochatim v'zorkin al tmei sheretz. But the same is not true for derech rechoka. As long as you're far away and you can get there in time to eat, that's fine. Okay, so that's how they reconciled their approaches with the question that was asked. Tanu Rabbanan. Here come the classic Gemara questions. What if? Let's say you can get there with horses and mules, and you have fast animals, you have an airplane, you can fly there, right? Nowadays, let's say you're derech rechoka, let's assume the temple was around, and you're in America, but you can get there in time because you can fly. Okay, maybe America's not a great example, but let's say if you're talking about 6-hour difference, right? Let's say you're in Rome, a 3-hour flight, and you can make it there. Are you derech rechoka or not? You might have thought, hey, you're obligated because it's not that far away. Talmud lomar ubederech lo haya, v'hala haya b'derech. What do we say, right? It says ubederech lo haya, and he was. It's all based on the derech. The derech is that border that we gave mina modi'in b'lachutz. But I want to stress again, Modi'in it doesn't seem like it's the city we know as Modi'in. It must be some other space, some other place that they knew. So he was, right? He was Baderech, he was outside that range. So he's not obligated, even though theoretically he could have made it there. Here's another good example. Let's say you're in, okay, this would clearly happen if there was a temple around. Okay, so you're in your regular place, you're not so far, but you're the kind of person who says, hey, I live pretty close. I'll leave late. What happens? There's major traffic on the way. Everybody's trying to get into Jerusalem. There's no way you're going to make it. Do you say, listen, I tried to get there in time, but I got stuck in traffic. So of course, what does the Gemara answer? Right? You might have thought you're not obligated. Right? You have to be not on the way. And you have to be, if you're within the range, you're within the range. It doesn't make a difference how long it's actually going to take you to get there. Okay. And therefore, right, it's like when I think about when I was in high school, the kids who lived, when I was teaching in high school, the kids who lived the closest to school always came the latest, right? Because they assumed, oh, I don't have to worry about whatever. And, they came the latest. So you can't, if you're within the range, the assumption is you got to get yourself there on time. You can't use that as your excuse. Okay. Take a deep breath. Now we start the difficult part of today's daf. Amar Rava. If we're already talking about how long does it take a person to walk in a day, we're now going to talk about what's the size of the world. Now, probably, right, it seems the rabbis assumed the world was flat. And now we're going to get into all sorts of questions about what the world was like, how big it was, and how thick. There's this assumption, and the Koran has this picture of like an arch where the world is underneath, and there's this arch, and that's where the sun goes, right? It goes kind of across the bottom of the arch during the day. That covers the whole ground of the world. And then again, this was this isn't what really happens. This is the way they understood it. Then there's this kind of like rainbow thing, this thick arch that the sun has to penetrate to get, it's called the Sumcha Dirakia, has to get through there to get out. That's where it is. The question is, where is it when we don't see it? So it must be going through this firmament that kind of leads to where it's going to be overnight. Then it goes either over, under, somewhere, probably over, right? And then comes around the other side and then goes back again every day. So it goes, through. And then how long does it take to pass through this thick firmament that gets it to the rakia, to the heavens where it is overnight or something like that? Again, it's hard for me to explain this exactly. And I'll already say that there's many different interpretations of a lot of these sugyot. So if you're reading some commentary, it's explaining it differently. I tried to go with the commentaries that made the most sense to me, the way I could also explain it, or at least attempt to. Then it goes out, so it penetrates this thick space in between the twilight hours, like dawn and dusk, basically, from which we call alot hashachar tol netzach hama, and from what we saw, it's right, shkia, sunset, to tzedek kochavim, till when the stars come out. That's when it's going through that thick firmament. Right? It's kind of like when you see the sunset, right? And then all of a sudden you don't see it. So I guess they said, where did it go? It must be in some space, right, where it can't be seen. So let's try to start understanding our sugya. Amar Rava. Shita alfe parse hava alma. The whole world is 6,000 parsaot. Okay, remember, parsa is 4 meal. Okay, so it's 6,000 parsaot. V'sumcha dirakia alpha parse. Okay, the thickness of this firmament, how thick is it? It's 1,000 parsaot. So now he tells you, how do I know this? Chada gemara v'chada svara. One is a tradition I have, which is about the 6,000, the size of the world. I got in a tradition. Okay, I learned it from my rabbi. V'chada svara. And the second part about the firmament, I figured out on my own. How so? He said, I held like what Rabbi Baruch Hana said in Rabbi Yochanan that we saw already in yesterday's daf. What's the average a person can cover in a day? Eser parsaot. Me'alot hashachar va'ad netzach hama 5 milim. Mishki al-chama ad tzedek kochavim 5 milim. Remember, 10 parsaot is 40 meal. So if it's 40 meal, what do we say? We have 5 meal in the Netzach Hama, right, in the early part before sunrise, 5 meal after sunset, right, until Tzedek Kochavim, and 30 during the day. Remember, we said 15 was a half a day's walk. So 30 during the day. So now, Nimtza, let's do the math. It's very simple math. Nimtza of Yosher Rakia Echad Mishishim Biyom. I put these formulas on the sheet so you could see, and you'll see there's a chart because it's going to be different opinions about what this is. So the first opinion is this opinion, and then of Yosher Rakia Echad Mishisha Biyom. 5/30 is 1/6, right? It's the ratio of how, right? It takes 5 hours to walk from Alot HaShachar to Netzach Hama, right? Before sunrise, when the sun starts to rise till it finishes rising. And from the end of the day, that compares to the whole day, 5 to 30, which is 1 to 6. So therefore, it must be, if the world is 6,000, this firmament must be 1/6 of that. So it must be 1,000. Okay, tough. We're now going to have 5 questions on Rava, and all of them are going to end with tiyuvta. Tiyuvta means we don't have a good answer, right? Tiyuvta is, it's a good question against him. Seems they really don't like his opinion here. So Meitive, the first is going to be about the ratio, the 1/6 ratio. And there's a bit of a problem with this Gemara. I'll say it right at the beginning. Rabbi Yehuda Omer. So they bring a brayta that Rabbi Yehuda says. Remember, Rava is an Amora. If you bring a Tana that goes against an Amora, it's always a bit of a problem. He says, of Yosha Rakia Echad Me'asara B'yom. The thickness of the Rakia is 1/10. In other words, this firmament that we're discussing is 1/10. Now, really, we're going to see, and this is why there's a bit of a problem, it's really 1/8. If you remember, we've seen different mathematical equations, and they're not exactly always accurate. They kind of round it off. So it could be they're rounding up 8 to 10, possible. Some people try to explain the sugya actually as 1 to 10, but I'm going to explain it as 1 to 8 because it's a much more simpler reading of the text. It just obviously has the difficulty that it says 1/10 and not 1/8. But many of them really explain that it's 1/8 and not 1/10. So now, how do we know this? Teda. Kama mahalach adam benoni biyom eser parsaot. He starts off with the same assumption that it's 10 parsaot, which is 40 meal. But you'll see on the chart, it's split up differently. Me'alot hashachar ad netzach hama arba'at milim. From alot to netz, you only walk 4 meal, not 5. So if you do 4 at the beginning of the day and 4 at the end of the day, same thing. So how much is left during the day? Right, that's 8. Subtract it from 40, you get to 32. So now the ratio between the time, remember, the sun is going through this firmament from this whole twilight time period, right? So we're going to say that's right between, both in the morning and at night, this in-between time period, it covers 4, right? So again, if a person would walk, that's time, the amount of time a person would walk from that time is 4 to 32. That's 1/8. Okay. And that's how we get to 1/8. And therefore your numbers are wrong because it should be an 1/8 of 6,000 and not a 1/6 of 6,000. Okay. Again, it should really be a chamishmona. Tiyuvta de Rava tiyuvta. So this seems to be a knockout against Rava. Now they say, by the way, it's not only a knockout of Rava. Before we get back to the other 4 questions against Rava, we're going to say tiyuvta de Ula tiyuvta. It's also a tiyuvta de Ula, because what did Ula say? When he wanted to get to 15, half a day's walk is 15, right? Minamo di'im velachutz, he said it's 15, it's half a day. It really should be 16, according to Rabbi Yehuda. So it's also a knockout to Ula. Now they want to know, lema tav tiyuvta de Rabbi Yochanan. Is it also a problem for Rabbi Yochanan? About Rabbi Yochanan says that it's a mahalach adam benoni. Remember, how did we start? Rava quoted, how do I know misfara? Because Rabbi Chana says in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, kama mahalech adam benoni biyom asara parsaot, right? And then Rava continued and said, from alot hashachar netzach hama 5 milim, mishkiat chama tzedek chavim 5 milim, and then you have 30 during the day, and that's how you get to the 1/6 ratio. The question is, did Rabbi Yochanan mean that also, or was he just talking about how much a person walks in a day? And that there's actually no disagreement with him and Rabbi Yehuda, because it's 10 parsaot, 40 meal. So is it a question to Rabbi Yochanan or not? So he could say, Amar lecha ana b'yamamahu da'am, right? I was really talking about during the day, meaning when I said this 40, I meant from alot hashachar to tzedek kochavim, and I meant 32 in the middle, 4 and 4 on the edges. The Rabbanan, but the rabbis, Ula and Rava, who heard me, misunderstood me. They added, now again, it's a little bit tricky how you read this line, but they added time, and it's how they get to 5, or how they think I meant 5, because they added an extra hour for people who start early or end late. In other words, maybe people start walking from before alot hashachar. Like if they heard me say 5, when I said 5, okay, again, there's different ways to read this, but when they heard me say 5, I meant 5, including someone who would get up even earlier than alot hashachar. But from alot hashachar to netz and from shkiat etzeit, you can really only go 4 hours. Okay, there might just be an extra hour right? If someone walks even earlier. Okay, now, next thing, and this actually goes back to a question I asked yesterday, which is, will this knock out Rabbi Chanina? Who's Rabbi Chanina? Rabbi Chanina yesterday said, how do we know that it's 5 hours that a person walks from Alot HaShachar to Nates? What do we assume? It's 5 hours. How do we know it's 5 hours? Well, they said because Lot, remember the Malachim, came in Alot HaShachar, right? They woke up then and they started going, and they got to Tzoar by Netz HaChama. So now, how much ground did they cover? They covered 5 mil. Okay, did I say the wrong thing? Sorry. They covered 5 mil. Okay, maybe I said parsaot by accident. They covered 5 mil in that time period. So now, if they covered 5 mil, then, 5 hours. Okay, my mistake. If they covered 5 mil, then what do we have here? We have, it seems to go against what we just said, that you only cover 4 mil. Now, you have to pay close attention. Rabbi Chanina didn't make this connection. Rabbi Chanina just said, I went to this place and I saw that the space they walked, which they happened to have walked from Alot HaShachar to Netz HaChama, was 5 mil. But he didn't say that's the amount that a person normally walks. And how do we know that? That we can explain that he doesn't think that, because Vayetzu Shane, remember I said yesterday, they're bringing an example of someone who ran. They were running for their lives away from stone. He went much faster. So you could say that Rabbi Chanina said it was 5 mil, but it's not that he disagrees. He just thinks really normally you walk 4 mil. In this case, they happened to walk 5 mil because they were running away. Okay, next. So that was all the first question on Rava, which then we tried to say, it's not only on Rava, it's also on Ula, but it's not necessarily on Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Chanina because they can explain it otherwise. And that's really all based on how many meal does a person cover between when the sun starts to rise to the sun finishes rising, and from the time the sun starts to set till the time the sun stops setting. Okay, now, next question on Rava. The next 3 questions are going to be not about the ratio, but this number that Rava claimed he had a masoret about how big the world is. We're now going to see sources that say you are way off. Okay, not just a little bit off, but these sources are going to say you are really off in terms of your count. Tashma, Mitzrayim haya 400 parsa al 400 parsa. Okay, Egypt was 400 by 400 parsaot, the area. Umitzrayim echad mishishim bekush, and Mitzrayim was 1/60th of the size of Kush. Bekush echad mishishim ba'olam, and Kush was 1/60th the size of the world. By the way, this source might not need to be understood literally. That's one way to explain this, but the source is basically trying to say, if you look at it from a different perspective, right, and we'll see when we get to the end, trying to say, right, the Egyptian kingdom was huge, right? And then we're going to say, but that compared to Kush was even, right, Kush was even larger. Now, I'm going to say the world is a chamishishim began. Okay, now the world compared to the Gan in Gan Eden, the Garden of Eden, is the whole world, right? The Gan is 60 times the size of that. Okay, we're clearly in exaggeration world, but they're going to take this literally. Vegan a chamishishim be'Eden, and the garden compared to Eden itself was just a small part of Eden. Now, why are we really trying to say all this? Ve'Eden a chamishishim be'Gehenom. And the whole idea was to say how large Gehenom is. Hell is way bigger than all these things, okay? And maybe scare tactics, not exactly sure, but they're trying to give this comparison. But if you take this literally, then it says, Nimtza kol ha'olam kulo ki kisoi ktera legehenom. The whole world is like a small cover, right? To the entire, right? The ratio between a pot cover to the entire pot. Okay, now, what's the math that we have to do? So either we want to take the area or we want to take the perimeter of the world. Either which way, we're going to get to numbers that have nothing to do with Rava's numbers. Rava said the whole world is 6,000 parsaot. Okay, according to this, if you do 400 times 60 times 60, because multiply by the 60th, right? Mitzrayim is the 60th of Kush. Kush is the 60th of the world. You get to 1,440,000. Okay, that's way more than 6,000. If you want to say he's talking about the area of the world, then you have to multiply that whole number by 400. And then you get to 576 million. Okay, so we're talking, this is really a problem, to which they say tiyuvta, right? Even if you say this source is a total exaggeration, it doesn't matter because you're still so far off from Rava's number. Tashma, second source. It's going to knock out third source against Rava, second source against this number of 6,000. Ditana de Be'eliyahu. Okay, they say, Rabbi Natan Omer, Kol HaYeshuv Kulo. This is going to be, okay, this part wasn't so complicated yet. This next part becomes very complicated because in order to understand it, you really have to understand the way they understood the stars, and they clearly didn't understand space the way we did. So it's very hard to understand what they mean here. Kol HaYeshuv Kulo Tachat Kochav Echad Yoshev. The whole world lives under one star. Okay, what does this mean? How do we know this? Teda. We know this because Sharei Adam Noteneino B'Kochav Echad. You look up at a star from where you're standing. Holech leMizrach, Omei Kenegdo, La'arba Rechad Olam, Omei Kenegdo. Wherever you look in the world, that star will be in the same place in the sky. So what do you see here? Mechlal. From here one can infer the Kol HaYeshuv Kulo Tachat Kochav Echad Yoshev. That each, now the way you have to take a jump from here, because this doesn't really tell you anything yet about the size of anything. But if each, let's say, okay, I think they had some understanding there was 1,000 parsaot under a star or something like that. But the assumption is each star is like a whole world in and of itself and covers a world or something like that. And then each star then, and let's say each one is minimum 1,000 parsaot, each one covers, now it's hard because it says it covers the whole world, but then it seems like each star kind of covers the whole world. And with that, there's so many stars, so it must be multiplied by the amount of stars. And therefore, we're going to clearly get to a number high, more than 6,000. So that, again, clearly disagrees with, again, I say clearly, it's hard to understand exactly what they mean, but assuming we take what they're saying as you multiply then all the other stars, and each star kind of has a space of that underneath it, in which case we're going to consider it that we must have a lot more than 6,000 parsaot. Next question, Tashma. Eglah b'tzafon, there's a debate whether this is Agala or Eglah. Are we talking about specifically the constellations Ursa Major and Akrav, which is Scorpio? Okay, or some people explain it a little differently, but we'll go with that. Eglah b'tzafon v'Akrav b'darom. So Ursa Major is always in the north, and Scorpio is always in the south. V'chol HaYeshuv kulo eino yoshev ela bein Agala la'Akrav. Now, there's this assumption that there's inhabited places in the world and non-inhabited places in the world, which we know to be the case. Right? So they say the whole world that's inhabited lives between these two constellations. And how do we know? Because we always see Ursa Major in the north and Scorpio in the south. So we assume that that's the range of our world from there to there. V'kol HaYeshuv kulo eino hava ela sha'a achat b'yom. She'ein chama nechneset liyeshuv ela achat b'yom. Now they're saying that the sun only shines 1 hour a day on the inhabited places in the world. It's a little strange. What do you mean the sun shines all day long? But what did they understand? Let's read a little bit more. Teda, how do we know this? Sounds like the beginning of our Masechet. If you remember, we talked about times of checking for chametz, and then we had this whole thing about what hours people will confuse. And we said, well, look, bechamesh, 5 hours into the day, chama b'mizrach, right? The sun is on the east. Ubesheva chama b'ma'arav. And on the 7th hour, the sun is already in the west. Therefore, chatzi shesh v'chatzi sheva, there's 1 hour where the sun is in the middle of the sky. That means if the sun is on the side of the sky, that means it's shining somewhere else, theoretically. That's the way they understood it. So it's only when the sun is in the middle of the sky that it shines on the inhabited parts of the world. Okay, again, right, they didn't talk about the equator and the other side of the equator or anything else, right? They believed the world was flat, and what we see is what's happening everywhere where there's people living. So Chama omedet berosh kol adam, right? So in that hour, it's standing on top of, right, the sun, and they also didn't seem to have time difference, right? We're here on a Zoom with people in all different time zones, right? According to this, would never what they think. But basically, that's the time when we have the sun directly shining on us. So that means that the sun, all the other times, since it's not directly shining on us, it must be shining on uninhabited places in the world. What does this show? This shows that the ratio between inhabited places and uninhabited places in the world is 1 to 12, which means that it can't possibly be that, right? And that's just simple math, that the whole world is 6,000 parsaot. If our world, what we see, the inhabited parts, are only 1/12 of the entire world, it can't possibly be that we're going to get to 6,000, because we're going to get to a much larger number than that. Therefore, tiyuvta. Okay, next source. According to the way I'm going to explain this source, okay, it's not so clear, but it seems like this source, there's different ways to understand it. This source is not contradicting the 6,000 number, it's contradicting the 1,000 number, the firmament, Remember, he said, right, I have a tradition about the world is 6,000. We just brought 3 contradictory sources to that. But now, and we had a problem with his ratio, but let's say you put all that aside. He still got to this number 1,000. This number 1,000 doesn't make any sense. Okay, that to get through the firmament, it's 1,000, right? 1,000 parsaot. So now, how do we know this isn't the case? So we're going to have a bit of a long source here. Tashmad. Amar Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. Ma tshuva heshivto bat kol le'oto rasha b'sha'a she'amar e'eleh b'matei av edameh le'elyon. Here's a verse from Yeshayahu. In Yeshayahu, it says that Nebuchadnezzar, who was considered, right, one of the biggest Rishaim, right, he destroyed the first temple. He said, I'm going to get up to the heavens, right? This is what I want to do. Now, what does it sound like? It sounds like Migdal Bavel, the Tower of Babel, which we're going to see was initiated, according to the Gemara, by Nimrod. So they're going to connect him as if he was a relative of his, as if he was his grandson, which he clearly wasn't his grandson. But this is the classic Gemara where we're going to connect two people who tried to do the same thing and say they were related, even though it doesn't really mean, you know, they were 100% related. But that's they mean related in terms of what they tried to do. So this is what he said. And the question is, what did the heavenly voice say to him when he said the following? I'm going to get up to the heavens. Yatzta bat kova amralo. So a heavenly voice comes down and says to Nebuchadnezzar, this obviously is a story about what theoretically should have been said to him. Rasha ben beno shel Nimrod Rasha. You're an evil person, the son of an evil person, the grandson of Nimrod, who tried to shehimrid et kol haolam kulo alai b'malchuto. He tried to get the whole world to go against me and rebel against me by building the Tower of Babel. Now, he says to him, okay, so you think you're smart. You think you could do this. I'll show you that you can't. Why? What does an average person live? 70 years. Don't worry for you 70-year-olds, right? Things have changed, thank God. But and if you're really strong, 80 shana. Okay, where did they get this from? They don't get this from their census, but they get this from a pasuk in Tehillim. Yemesh notenu bahem 70 shana, ve'im bigvurot 80 shana. Right? Say this in our davening. So, right, the years are 70. And if you're very strong, then yes, you could get to 80. Now, so you're going to live maximum, you'll live 80 years. Now, why is this not going to help you to get to me? Because it takes hundreds of years to get to me, okay, or thousands. How do I know this? Because mina aretz ad l'rakia, this is what the heavenly voice is telling Nebuchadnezzar. From, according to the source, from the aretz, okay, you have to get from the land up to the heaven. Okay, then once you get to the heavens, there's 7 layers of heavens. Okay, so remember, we want to know what this first layer of firmament is that you have to get through to get to the rakia. So mina aretz ad l'rakia, guess how long it's going to take you? Malach 500 shana. It's 500 years to travel that space. Ve'ov yosha rakia, this was before space travel, right? Ve'ov yosha rakia mahalach 500 shana. And the thickness of the firmament, here you see it. How thick is it? It's 500 years. Now, that's obviously not 1,000 parsaot. Okay, it's not a 500-year distance. So that already knocks out Rava. Uben rakia la rakia, even between each level of the heavens, mahalach 500 shana, v'chein ben kol rakia v'rakia. Okay, so basically we're going to get, right, each rakia itself is 500, and in between there's 500 to get from one level to the other. So you're never going to make it, basically, to me. Therefore, what does the pasuk say about him? Ach el sha'ol turad el yarkatei bor. You're going down into the pits. So do you want to get up to me? You're just going down. Tiyuvta. So here again, you have a knockout of Rava. And with that, we finish all the knockouts of Rava, but we haven't finished all the talk about the constellations. Since we're already up to this, they're now going to bring 2 different sources that talk about different approaches between the Jews and the Gentiles of their time. Some people try to explain, again, there's many different ways to explain these sources. I'll already put it out there. Some people try to connect it with the ancient Greeks and what they believed and try to read that into these sources. It's right. These are all possible theories. Okay. There's many different theories about how to understand this. I'm just going to try to kind of explain it simply. We're not going to fully understand all of this. Tanu Rabbanan, Chachmei Yisrael omrim, galgal kavua umazalot chozrim. The Chachmei Yisrael believe that now we're talking about the Galgal HaMazalot. Okay, there's this ring, like a sphere of constellations. The Galgal itself is stationary. The Mazalot chozrin, and the Mazalot turn in their place. Okay. The Chachmei Umot HaOlam omrim Galgal chozer u'Mazalot kfuim. No, it's the sphere with all of them in it rotates. The mazalot stay in their place. Okay, so it's not that the mazalot move, it's the the circle moves. Amar Rebbe, tshuva l'divreihem, I'm going to tell you why they're wrong. Me'olam lo matzinu egla b'darom v'akrav b'tzafon. Egla is always in the south, and akrav is always in the north. If the whole ring of all these constellations turned, then it would be in a different location, right? One would be in the tzafon at some point, and in the darom at the other point, and then right, it would switch north-south. But matkif l'Rav Acha bar Yaakov, and here's where you see what I pointed on the Koran. They said that the rabbis had different approaches themselves about these things. And this says you can't prove that from there. Maybe it's like the I'm not sure what the word is, but the pin, the part that's in the middle of the millstone, that turns, right? That stays stationary while it causes the millstone to turn. Okay, the socket, thank you. Or the tzinor dedasha, which is the hinge on the door. Now, there's different ways to understand this, okay? This could mean that they stand in one place, right? And it makes the door move. So in other words, it could turn without actually moving itself. Okay, and as the ring around it could turn, but they could stay in their place like the hinge stays in place. That to me seems like the simplest. Rashi actually explains it. I think it's Rashi who explains it in a way that it could go in both directions. As if you were to keep the door stationary, then the hinge theoretically could move. Likewise with the socket. And that he tries to prove something else from there. But in any case, he says you can't prove this from here. Then we have another source that seems it's a similar structure. Okay, but you'll see Rebbe has a different approach this time. This time he's going to support the Gentile approach and not the Jewish approach, which is just interesting. So Chachmei Yisrael omrim b'yom chama mahalechet lamata min harakia u'balayla lamala min harakia. During the day, the sun is underneath the heavens, and at night, the sun is above the heavens. Okay, this is like what we said, how the sun kind of goes through, and then it goes through the firmament and goes over. During the day, the sun goes under the heavens, and at night, it doesn't go above, it goes under the ground. So now, here it seems, they seem to be correct. Why? The waters are cold at night. We saw this source before. And at night, they're boiling. So it must be that the sun is underneath the ground at night. Now, this is how they tried to determine, right? They say some of the springs are very hot at night. That's because, right, they're hotter at night than during the day. And they try to explain it by saying it must be the sun is underneath. Tanya Rabbanit Omer. Now, there's again, with simple, they didn't have major methods of figuring all these things out. So they made these assumptions. Tanya Rabbanit Omer. Now we know that the sun is, right, the way they're going to say the sun is in different locations during the year, which is going to affect the weather patterns. So in the summer, the Chama is begova shel rakia. It's high, closer to the sky, the heavens. Lefichach kol ha'olam kulo roteach. That's why it's very hot. Explains hot climates. But mayanot soninim. But the springs are cold because the sun is much farther from the springs. But b'yamot shamim chama mahalecha b'shipulei rakia. In the summer, in the winter months, the sun is much lower in the sky, which means that's why kol ha'olam kulo tzonein. It's cold here because the sun is kind of more toward the ground than it is toward us. Again, it's very hard to understand exactly what this means. Umayanot rotchim. That's why the underground is hotter because it's down low, the sun, and we're above that, so it doesn't really get to us as much. If we're talking about seasons, now they bring another braita about this. Tanu Rabbanan ba'arba'a shvilin chama mahalechet. There's 4 paths the sun takes during the 4 different seasons. Nisan, Iyar, Sivan, in the spring months. Mahachot baharim kedei lefasher et hashlagim. It goes in the mountains. The sun is by the mountains to basically make the snow melt. Tammuz, Av, Elul, in the summer. Mahalechet b'yishuv kedei levashel et haperot, to help ripen. That's why it's warmer in the inhabited places, not the mountains. Places where people live, in order to ripen the fruits. They're basically connecting this to their agricultural cycle. Tishrei, Mar Cheshvan, v'Kislev, in the autumn, Mahalechet bayamin kedei liyabeshet hanarot. It's to dry out the rivers, which basically causes the rain to come. That's basically what they're saying. Tevet Shvat Adar Mahalechet b'midbar shelo liyabeshet hazra'im. Then it goes, the sun moves to the desert in the winter months in order not to dry out. It's not so hot, because if it was so hot, it would dry out all the stuff that's trying to grow that we just planted. Okay, finished that section. I can't promise we understood it 100%, that's for sure not, but at least we made an understanding of how to get through those sources and how to understand them on a basic level. There's probably lots more to read about this. You can do your own research if constellations and stars interest you. So you could try to search online for different articles and things that explain these things from, if you want to go back in terms of what the Greek thought was and how this all connects. Okay, moving on to our strange, if this wasn't strange, we now have this strange shita of Rabbi Eliezer that says that you're b'derech rechoka if you're standing right outside the azara, that's considered rachok. So the Gemara is obviously going to ask, this doesn't make any sense. Even though you can actually just go right in, you're still exempt. It seems so crazy. And they don't say, hey, just go inside and then you'll be obligated. And even more so, we're going to prove that Rabbi Eliezer does sound like he thinks that you should make sure to do the Korban Pesach if you can. If you have a Jew who hasn't yet done a circumcision, anush karet, he gets karet, divrei Rabbi Eliezer. In other words, you can just circumcise yourself and then you can do the Korban. So what are you waiting for? Same thing if you're right outside the Azara. So how do you reconcile this approach of Rabbi Eliezer with the other approach? So we're going to have two different answers. Amar Abaye, we're going to start with the way we started today. He's going to say, derech rechoka l'tahor ve'ein derech rechoka l'tameh. You're comparing apples and oranges. Someone who's tameh and someone who's arel is similar to someone who's tameh, who's uncircumcised, and if they have something wrong with their body that prevents them, that's something different. Then figure it out, come up with a solution. But derech rechoka is for a tahor. Even a tahor person who has everything right, he still gets to be exempt. So therefore, we don't make him go in, right? If there's something wrong with you, we'll fix it and take care of it. But that's not the case for derech rechoka. It's a whole different ballgame. Rava Amar Tanaihi. Rava says actually there's a debate among the Tanaim what Rabbi Eliezer actually said. And in which case we're going to say it's not clear Rabbi Eliezer said this. And it's actually a very strange proof he brings. Because you would have expected them to bring a proof that he holds that you really have to be far, like 15 meal. But instead of 15 parsot, 15 meal, keep confusing us. But instead, what he does is he brings two different opinions about Rabbi Eliezer. Neither of them say you have to really be far, but he assumes if there's two opinions, there must be a third about what he says that would say min hamodim v'lachutz. So, which would then match the Arel should basically make his way there. So how do we see this? Tanahi detanya, as it says in the following bright, Rabbi Eliezer omer ne'emar richuk makom b'Pesach v'ne'emar richuk makom b'Maaser. Maaser sheni is if you're too far, then you can instead of carrying your fruits, right, you can redeem them onto a coin. So what does it mean to be far? It says kir chak mimcha makom. If the place is too far, it's very similar to here. Mal halang chutz lachilato, afkan chutz lachilato. How do we determine it? If you're right on the border, but you're right outside Jerusalem, right, you can only eat Maaser Sheni in Jerusalem, then you can redeem it on a coin, no problem. Once you cross that border, you can't, but it's all about the border. And it's all about the border of where it can be eaten. Likewise here, it goes by where you eat. So here we're going to say the borders according to Rabbi Eliezer are the borders of Jerusalem, not the borders of the Azara. If you're right outside Jerusalem, then you're exempt. If you're in Jerusalem, outside the Azara, you're not exempt. Rabbi Yossi bar Rabbi Yehuda Omer Mishum Rabbi Eliezer, he understands Rabbi Eliezer's name differently. Chutz la'asiyato, outside of where you do the korban, which is outside the Azara. So now already you see there's two opinions. Now they're just going to assume there must be a third that says min hamodim v'lachutz. According to, does this approach go that says when they counted how many people are tamei to figure out is Tumah Hutra B'tzibur this year, do we have a majority of Tmeim? They counted only the people in the Azara. Now you have to question, how did all these tamei people get into the Azara? That's a whole separate question. But he says it goes by who's actually in the Azara. Well, who does that go according to? It sounds like that everything is determined. Derech rechoka is also, are you outside the Azara? The Azara is the determining location for a lot of different things about the korban, it seems. Last line for today. If you remember in the Mishnah, Rabbi Yossi brought a proof, and he said that's why there's a dot on the hay, derech rechoka, as if to say not really rechoka, not really far away. Tanya, Rabbi Yossi Aglili Omer, we're now going to have a different interpretation, but Rabbi Yossi Aglili, derech. From the word derech, if you're b'derech rechoka, right, you're far away. Shomeani malach shnayim o shlosh yamim. It sounds like far away. What would you think? Far away, 2 or 3 days away. It sounds very far. But kishehu omer, when the pasuk says u'b'derech lo haya, but if you weren't far away, right, and you'll notice what word is missing in that pasuk. It doesn't say far away. It just says, but if you weren't on the way, okay, and it doesn't say far away, Therefore, magid she'askufat hazara v'lachutz karoi derech. From there, you can see that you just have to be away outside of the area where you're meant to be, and that's the azara. And he gets it from there, and not necessarily from the dot on the hay. Okay, so that was a different approach. We're going to stop here and pick up with our next Mishnah tomorrow. Have a great day, everyone.